Trading is one of the most effective ways to win your leagues, but you have to make sure that you're doing it properly. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 of my favorite trade strategies or philosophies that I think you should be using to win your trades and ultimately win your leagues. You may know some of these strategies, you may currently use some of these strategies, but hopefully I can expand on them a little bit more than what you were thinking to give you an idea of how to properly trade in your leagues. My name's Mike, and let's jump into the video. In the early parts of the season, it's so common for yourself or other managers in the league to panic early on or overhype a lot of players, and this could lead to good trades for you or bad trades for you. It really depends on who you're moving and what kind of trades you're making. And the biggest thing for me is the philosophy of buy when people are selling and sell when people are buying. When those players are struggling in the early going and managers begin to panic to start the season, this is the perfect time for you to swoop in and make a trade for those underperforming players, and vice versa. If you have players that are off to a really hot start and your managers are interested in them, but if they're performing above their career averages, if their shooting percentages are inflated, and you're hearing from us or other experts that you should be moving them, maybe it's time to move on. There's a fallacy of falling in love with players, and you see it all the time in fantasy. If you have a guy that did really well for you for the first 2 weeks, you may not want to be moving them, but then they begin to struggle and then you're trying to trade them. So don't be trying to trade players when they're struggling. Try to trade players when they're performing well to hopefully return some really good value. In the early going rankings, they're going to be skewed, and you're going to see that in one of my strategies, but you just have to keep in mind early on where players were drafted. So if you draft someone in the 7th round and you get offered someone that was drafted in the 13th round, you may not want to make that trade, even though the guy in the 13th round may be outperforming your 7th round pick. You drafted him 7th round for a reason. There's a reason why the projections projected him there and 6 rounds ahead of the 13th round guy, and vice versa. So make sure that you're always actively using projections. We have our own fantasy puck projections that we use and update weekly, or just use your own analysis to determine long-term value. And the way to do this is just look at players' current situations. Is the 13th round player line 1, power play 1, and your 7th round player line 3, power play 2? If so, then you can use your own little analysis to understand, okay, maybe player B has a way better situation than player A, therefore his long-term value is just a lot better. So you can use your own analysis. You don't just have to use what the experts think, what we think, or what the projections think. Just assess your own situation for those players and determine what their long and short-term value is. And lastly, just know the players in your league and their tendencies. And the most common example of this is Leafs fans. You know that you can get a haul back for Tyler Bertuzzi or William Nylander. Just know the players in your leagues, the managers in your leagues, and who they like, their tendencies. Does someone tend to drop players? If you're in a keeper league and you've been playing with the same people for 5-6 years, there are going to be guys that are panic sellers or panic buyers, and try to leverage this to your advantage to get good value from them. Are you the type of manager that is actively sending trades but with the same player to every single manager? If you are, then just stop doing that, because you're showing your hand and you're showing them that you want to get rid of this player. And managers tend to pick up on things and say, why do you keep offering me this player? Is there something about them you don't like? Did you see them in a video that said you should be trading them away? People will understand and people will pick up on your tendencies if you're someone that continually offers the same player to the other managers. And the way to negate this is just allow people to send you trades and open up a trade block. Tell them that you have 3 or 4 players that you're looking to trade away and to send you trades. And this kind of negates the fact that you're just sending Roope Hintz to 6 or 7 managers. But if you open up a trade block and say, these are 3 guys I'm trading: Roope Hintz, Charlie McAvoy, Noah Dobson, send me some offers for them. So they don't know that you're specifically trying to trade away one player, and that you get a whole array of offers to see what managers are thinking, who they're overvaluing, or even some players that they may be trying to trade away. Another philosophy is throwing in the player you want to move. And what I mean by that is, if you want to get rid of Roope Hintz and you trade someone, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, for Dougie Hamilton, and they're like, no, I don't think that value is good enough, and say, okay, well, what about Roope Hintz? And in the end, that's the guy you wanted to trade, and the value is pretty much the same as Nugent-Hopkins, but maybe you think Roope has less long-term value given his injuries right now. This goes the other way, is stop sending offers for the same player. So if you really want a Vander Kane from somebody, don't be offering him for Evander Kane in 6, 7, 8 trades, because after a while they're going to say there's definitely a reason why you want Evander Kane and why you keep trading me for Evander Kane. So it works both ways. If you're offering managers a player over and over again, they're going to pick up on how you want to get rid of the player. And if you keep offering someone for the same player, they're going to pick up and say, why do you want this player so bad? So the philosophy works both ways for sending and receiving trades. For me, just try to not show your hand very early. Try and not just send the same players and try and trade for the same players, because managers will become complacent. They'll say, why are you doing this? Why are you sending me this player? And ultimately, it will ruin your chances at being able to trade for or away a player. The old elementary school philosophy in treat others the way you want to be treated, it's the same way as trading. Trade as you want to be traded. And the biggest fallacy that I see in trades is you're just trying to give away your worst players. My trading block right now is Casey DeSmith. It's Tyler Seguin. It's players that you just like are on the brink of not making your team, or on the brink of you dropping them for a stream spot or someone on free agency. I get the philosophy of shot before you drop, and I've heard that a lot in fantasy, but I don't believe in it as much. When if it's a player you want to drop, it's most likely that other managers don't want that player as well. There's a reason to why they should be on free agency and the reason why you should be dropping them. Now, the big thing that I don't see as much, and I wish I saw more, is if you want to upgrade a position, give your the other fantasy manager an upgrade as well. And the example last season is that I had a lot of winger depth in one of my big leagues and not much defenseman depth. So I traded a player who was performing extremely well in Brad Marchand and got a defenseman I liked in Dougie Hamilton. Both were ranked relatively the same. Both had pretty much the same long-term outlook. It's just I had a lot of wingers, he didn't, and he had a lot of defense and I didn't, right? So it satisfied both parties, rather than me trying to send a 2-for-1 and trading two guys that are just on the brink of not making my team for one of their best defensemen. So if you want to be targeting a high valued player, give your other manager a high value player in return that satisfies both parties. And maybe this does hurt you long term, but if you fill a position that is a little bit more scarce on your team, if you have injuries, then that will help you out long term. And lastly, 2-for-1s are just not really as good as they seem. If someone offers you two players that combined have 700 points for a player that you have that gets on his own 450 points, it's likely not worth it, because that single player is outperforming both players that were part of the trade. So in 2-for-1s, you also have to keep in mind that if you're receiving two players and you're giving away one, you have to drop a player. So what is the value of that other player that's not included in the trade? If you trade, for example, Mitch Marner to another manager for Roope Hintz and Nugent Hopkins, if you receive Nuge and Hintz, you're going to have to drop a player on your roster because you're getting two players for trading away one, unless you have an open roster spot. So if that last player is Rickard Rakell, I would probably want Marner and Rakell over the other two. So just make sure you're keeping that in mind when you're doing 2-for-1s. They're not really as good as it seems, and I see it very often when people tell me, well, combined their points are better than the other player that I'm giving away. But it may not be the case. If you average out both players' points compared to the one player you have, it may not add up to be a better trade than you think. Lastly, know the managers in your league. Sometimes managers may actually prefer 2-for-1s, or maybe the managers in your league are looking for something else that you could trade them to satisfy their demands. It's a little bit different than knowing managers that are just Leafs fans, but knowing what managers want and what they're looking to give away. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to use Yahoo rankings as my example. I don't actually have any active leagues on ESPN or Fantrax, so I'm not entirely sure how the ranking system works, but I assume it's relatively the same. So for the Yahoo rankings, it adjusts almost daily. After games are played, all the rankings will adjust depending on the success or not success of a player, and the rankings become extremely inflated or deflated early on. And the main example of this is I saw in the Discord recently, someone was talking about how they got offered a trade for JT Miller and said, well, JT Miller is the fourth ranked player in my league, but there's also only been 2 games played. So will he maintain that 4th ranking for the longevity of the season? It's pretty unlikely. So early on, just kind of ignore the rankings. If you get a trade for rank 20 and you're returning at rank 18 and rank 115, just make sure you know the long-term value of those guys, and you can just use simple applications that are at your disposal. You can use the 2022 rankings, you can sort by that on Yahoo, you can use expert rankings and see what the experts think, or you can just look at career numbers and see when guys are over or underperforming. That's probably the best way to do it. And I find that rankings are always skewed for certain leagues and categories. I play in a league that has penalty minutes, hits, and pretty much covers every category. So a guy like Pat Maroon is ranked right around the same as Clayton Keller because Maroon was the PIMS leader last year. It also put up 200 plus hits, where Clayton Keller was the same as most guys and put up 35 goals, 35 assists, but didn't have PIMS and didn't have hits. So their rankings are relatively the same. But the way to negate this is that you should be looking on your free agency to see, are there replaceable players? For Clayton Keller, probably not. You probably aren't able to find a guy that's going to be putting up 80 points and 35 goals. But a guy like Pat Maroon, you could probably find a 100 PIM, 200 plus hit player on free agency. So you just have to make sure that you're looking at your free agency and saying, is this player easily replaceable? With the Clayton Keller point, probably not. With the Pat Maroon point, probably. So this could be advantageous to you in some occasions if you're making trades to players, and this goes back to just knowing the other managers in your league. Some managers may not use rankings. Some managers may not look at what the experts are saying. Some people may not use career numbers, and if they're not, they may just look at the Yahoo rankings and say, oh my god, this guy's ranked 32 and he's offering me him for Andrei Svechnikov, who's ranked 700. So it could be advantageous to you sometimes, but make sure you're not in the receiving end of just chasing players that have high ranks or getting rid of players that have low ranks because they haven't played enough games or they just had a few tough matchups to start the season. This is a weird philosophy, but I think it's one that actually is very effective long term, and a lot of people fall into the trap of just looking at the rankings and determining trades through there. The final strategy, and I feel like this just isn't talked about enough, is evaluating your timeline and your team. And don't panic when you start the season 0-3. Fantasy season goes for 22, 23 weeks, and if you're 0-3, don't sell out too early. You may have players that are injured. I'm in a couple leagues where I have 4 or 5 guys on my IR and I'm not doing as good as I want to be, but when they come back, my team's going to be extremely strong and competitive in the second half of the fantasy season, and so much can change throughout the season. The best fantasy managers in your league may have injury problems in the next week, in 2 weeks, at pretty much any point in the season that can really hurt their long-term outlook. So don't panic too early. Stay true to your team. Stay true to the players that you drafted. And if you're 0-3 to start the season, you just got to be hustling in the trades. You got to be hustling on the free agency, and you got to make sure that you're starting your lineups. As soon as you sell out and say, I'm done with the season, I'm not setting my lineups anymore, I'm not trying to be active, that's when your season goes down the drain. But if you remain active, you will definitely finish in the playoff race or as a competitive team in your league. Now, when it goes back to the evaluating your timeline, you need to understand if you need production now or later. If you start the season off 3-0, you may want to go and get a guy like Patrick Kane, who's going to join your team in the second half of the season and help you with a playoff run. But that's only if your team has been very strong to start the season. Now, the other side of it is, do you need production now? So if you're starting 0-3 and you're stashing 3-4 guys on your injury list, maybe you need to make some trades to be productive now to give you a glimpse of hope to make playoffs in the second half, but also give up on some of that long-term value. But at least if you get the short-term value and the production now type of player, then you have a chance to make a playoff run and make playoffs and be a more competitive team. Another thing I'm seeing a lot is you fall in love with players and they may hurt you long term. Last year, we knew that Hampus Lindholm was going to be a very, very good first half player. But as soon as Charlie McAvoy came back, we knew he'd be getting the power play 1 duties. We knew he'd be taking minutes away from Lindholm. Just because Hampus Lindholm was extremely strong for you in the first half doesn't mean he's going to be very good for you in the second half. And a player like that right now that just comes to mind is Oliver Ekman-Larsson, that is going to get hurt once Ekblad and Montour return to the lineup in the next 2 months or so. So with Oliver Ekman-Larsson, if he starts off really good and his ownership percentage is going up, and fantasy managers are asking you to trade, I would probably be looking to move him before those good players come back or before the fantasy managers get note that Ekblad and Montour are returning. Another thing is to look at your roster and just see who's over and underperforming, just evaluating your whole team as a whole. If you drafted a guy in the 13th round and he's performing as a top 30, a top 40 player, maybe you want to look to move him for a guy that was drafted much earlier and has way more long-term value. And it's the same thing with your underperforming players, and this goes back to strategy 1, where you don't need to panic very early. A lot of people are saying, like, do I move Svechnikov? Do I drop Owen Tippett? don't panic. These are guys that you drafted that you know have long-term value in there, are going to be successful this season. So don't panic. But if you do ended up panicking a little bit, there's always time to recoup those drops or recoup some of the players that you moved and you just, you may have regretted. I'm just seeing some trades in the Discord or some drops in the Discord that people are not happy about. But don't worry, it's a long season. There's a lot of moves to be made. So just make sure you're actively evaluating your team, your timeline, and giving your fantasy team the best chance to succeed in playoffs. Hopefully, some of these strategies in this video give you insight on how to make trades and ultimately win your fantasy hockey leagues. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you leave a like on your way out and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Thank you for watching, guys, and I look forward to seeing everybody in the next video.